You fall asleep feeling exhausted, but almost every night you wake up around 3 a.m. Your eyes open suddenly, your body feels tired, yet your mind feels alert and busy. Thoughts start racing without a clear reason, and going back to sleep feels harder than it should. This pattern often comes with a racing mind, light and fragile sleep, and mornings where you don't feel restored. Even if you sleep again for a few hours, the rest never feels deep enough. Sleep science explains that this experience is incredibly common and deeply misunderstood. What's important to understand is this. This is not classic insomnia, and it's not a lack of discipline or routine. Sleep science explains that your brain may be responding to internal nighttime signals, entering what's called the neural sleep inhibition response. And once you see why this happens inside the brain, everything changes. I'm Dr. Sarah, a sleep medicine specialist with a background in psychiatry, and for years I've worked with people who struggle to stay asleep at night. Many of them fall asleep without much trouble, but wake up in the early morning hours feeling suddenly alert. They often describe the same confusion and frustration, wondering why their brain feels awake while their body feels exhausted. This pattern shows up far more often than most people realize. In clinical practice, this type of sleep disruption follows clear patterns. It appears in people with different lifestyles, stress levels, and ages. Some are young and healthy, others are older and very disciplined about sleep. What they share is not weakness or poor habits, but a brain that has learned to stay alert at the wrong time of night. Sleep science explains this as a nervous system signaling issue, not a personal failure or willpower. When experts in sleep health study these cases, they look closely at brain activity, hormones, and circadian rhythm. They observe how melatonin should rise to protect deep sleep and how cortisol should stay low until morning. But in many people who wake up at 3 a.m., this balance becomes unstable during the night, causing the brain to shift into a lighter, more alert state. This is why the problem feels so confusing from the inside. You may do everything right before bed, yet still experience a racing mind in the middle of the night. Studies show this doesn't mean your sleep system is broken. It means the brain is misreading internal signals of safety and timing. From the brain's perspective, this response makes sense, even if it feels exhausting and unfair to you. I want you to hear this clearly and calmly. You're not alone in this experience, and you're not doing anything wrong. Your brain is responding to biological signals, not personal choices or character flaws. When you understand what those signals are, the entire problem becomes far less frightening. Because once we look at why the brain switches into alert mode, we can see how the sleep switch gets interrupted during the night. That interruption doesn't happen randomly. It follows a predictable internal sequence, one that sleep science has already mapped out. And to understand that sequence, we need to look at what's happening inside the body after you fall asleep. When sleep begins, your body follows a very precise biological rhythm. Melatonin starts to rise, telling the brain that it's safe to rest. Your nervous system shifts into a calmer state, heart rate slows, breathing deepens, and the body prepares for deep restorative sleep. This process is guided by your circadian rhythm, an internal clock that controls timing throughout the night. At the same time, cortisol is meant to stay low. Cortisol is the alertness hormone, designed to rise closer to morning, not the middle of the night. When this balance is stable, the brain keeps the sleep switch turned on, allowing long, continuous periods of deep sleep. This is how the body repairs and resets itself overnight. But when the brain senses a disruption, even without a real external threat, this balance begins to shift. Melatonin can flatten or drop too early, while cortisol rises at the wrong time. Sleep science explains that this change signals the brain to move into a lighter, more alert state. Once that happens, the sleep switch struggles to stay active. The brain becomes easier to wake, more sensitive to thoughts, sensations, and internal noise. This is what experts call a hyperactive brain at night. The body may still feel tired and heavy, but the mind becomes alert, watchful, and reactive. That's often when people wake up around 3 a.m. From the inside, this feels sudden and confusing. You didn't choose to wake up. You didn't think your way into alertness. Your brain shifted states automatically based on hormonal timing and nervous system signals. This is not a failure of relaxation or mindset. This is a biological response, not a personal weakness. When this pattern repeats night after night, the brain starts to expect alertness during certain hours. It learns that the middle of the night is a time to monitor, not a time to fully rest. That learned response doesn't disappear on its own, and it explains why sleep can feel fragile or easily broken. To understand how this pattern forms, we need to look deeper at the brain's safety system. During the night, your brain is constantly scanning internal signals. It's not just listening for sounds or movement, it's monitoring hormones, breathing patterns, heart rhythm, and energy levels. When something feels slightly off, even if there is no real danger, the brain can interpret that change as a potential risk. This is how nighttime awakenings quietly begin. When the brain senses uncertainty, it activates what sleep science calls the brain safety response. This response is automatic and protective by design. It gently pulls the brain towards alertness, just enough to assess what's happening inside the body. The intention is safety, not disruption, but the side effect is lighter and more fragile sleep. As this safety response turns on, the deep sleep signal gets interrupted. Deep sleep requires the brain to feel fully secure. When that sense of security weakens, the brain reduces how deeply it allows you to rest. You may still be asleep, but closer to the surface than before. This is why people experience different versions of the same issue. Some wake up suddenly at 3 a.m. with a racing mind. Others wake briefly and fall back asleep, but never feel truly rested in the morning. Some don't remember waking at all, yet still feel exhausted the next day. Different symptoms, same internal cause. Across ages, lifestyles, and stress levels, sleep experts see this pattern repeat itself. The brain is not malfunctioning, it's responding exactly as it was designed to. From the brain's perspective, staying alert during uncertainty is protective. That's why this experience feels so persistent and frustrating. The key detail most people miss is this: your brain isn't waking you up to punish you, it's doing its best to keep you safe. Once that response becomes familiar, the brain begins to reuse it automatically at night, and that learned pattern has a name in sleep science. To understand it fully, we need to look at the critical inversion most people never hear. Most people are told the problem is falling asleep. They focus on how long it takes to drift off, what they did before bed, or how to shut their thoughts down faster. But sleep science explains something very different. The problem isn't falling asleep. The real issue is staying asleep. For many people, the brain knows how to initiate sleep. Melatonin still rises enough to start the process. The body still relaxes at the beginning of the night. But staying asleep requires a deeper signal of safety. When that signal weakens, the brain quietly shifts toward alertness. That shift happens long before you consciously wake up. When the brain doesn't feel safe enough, it activates a protective mechanism. Sleep science calls this the neural sleep inhibition response. This response limits deep sleep, keeps the nervous system slightly engaged, and makes the sleep switch unstable during the night. From the brain's view, this is prevention, not a problem. Once this response is active, the brain treats the night as a time for monitoring. It becomes more sensitive to internal changes, more likely to interrupt the deep sleep signal. That's why awakenings feel sudden and unavoidable. You're not choosing to wake up. Your brain is responding before you're even aware of it. Here's the part that brings real relief. This response is not permanent. The brain learned this pattern over time. It learned to associate certain nighttime signals with risk. Sleep science shows that learned responses can be reversed. If the brain learned this response, it can also unlearn it. That shift doesn't happen by force or effort. It happens when the brain receives consistent signals of safety, not just once, but night after night. Those signals calm the nervous system, stabilize melatonin, and prevent early cortisol spikes. And when that happens, the sleep switch stays on longer. To see how that process works, we need to understand what most approaches get wrong. Many people try everything they're told to do. They build a strict bedtime routine, they avoid screens, drink calming teas, practice positive thinking, or listen to relaxing sounds. All of these can help the body feel calmer, but sleep science shows they often don't fix the core issue because the central signal in the brain remains unchanged. These strategies work on the surface level. They reduce stimulation and encourage relaxation, but staying asleep requires something deeper. The brain needs consistent signals of safety, especially during the most vulnerable hours of the night. When those signals are missing or unstable, the nervous system stays partially alert. Experts in sleep health explain that the brain doesn't respond to intention alone. You can want to sleep, believe positive thoughts, and still experience sudden awakenings. That's because the brain prioritizes protection over comfort. If it senses uncertainty, it keeps monitoring. This is why frustration builds over time. People start blaming stress, age, or themselves. They think they're doing something wrong, but the real issue is that the brain has not received the signals it needs to fully stand down. Without those signals, alertness quietly persists at night. Sleep science shows that repeated alertness teaches the nervous system to expect disruption. Each awakening reinforces the pattern. The brain becomes faster at switching into light sleep, not because it's damaged, but because it's adapting to what it believes is necessary, and adaptation can feel very hard to reverse. What most tips never address is timing and consistency. The brain doesn't change from one calm night. It changes when safety signals repeat in a predictable way. That's what allows melatonin to stay stable and cortisol to remain low until morning. Without that foundation, sleep stays fragile. To see what actually restores that foundation, we need to look at the mechanism itself. Sleep science uses the term neural sleep inhibition response to describe a very specific brain state at night. It's a condition where the brain limits deep sleep on purpose, not because something is wrong, but because the brain believes it needs to stay alert. In this state, rest becomes lighter and easier to interrupt. The intention is protection, not disruption. When this response is active, the sleep switch doesn't fail completely. It turns on, but it can't stay fully engaged. Deep sleep starts, then pulls back. The brain allows rest in short segments, never fully letting go of awareness. That's why sleep feels shallow or easily broken. Experts in sleep health explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine your brain as a nighttime security system. When it feels safe, the system stays quiet. Lights are dim, alarms are off, and the house can rest peacefully. But when the system detects uncertainty, it stays partially armed, even without a real threat. The neural sleep inhibition response works the same way. The brain senses internal changes and stays on guard. It blocks sustained deep sleep as a precaution. This happens silently, without conscious control. You don't choose this state. You don't cause it by thinking the wrong thoughts. Your brain enters it automatically to protect you. Here's the part that brings real relief. This response is not permanent. The brain learned this pattern over time. It learned to associate certain nighttime signals with risk. Sleep science shows that learned responses can be reversed. If the brain learned this response, it can also unlearn it. That shift doesn't happen by force or effort. It happens when the brain receives consistent signals of safety, not just once, but night after night. Those signals calm the nervous system, stabilize melatonin, and prevent early cortisol spikes. And when that happens, the sleep switch stays on longer. Once you understand this mechanism, the problem feels less mysterious and less personal. Sleep isn't being taken away from you, it's being delayed by a safety response. And safety responses can be gently recalibrated, not by force, but by signals the brain already understands. To see how that recalibration begins, we need to look at what actually helps the brain stand down at night. The first shift is understanding what doesn't work. Forcing sleep creates more pressure, not more rest. Trying to sedate the body may cause shutdown, but it doesn't teach the brain that it's safe. Sleep science explains that safety cannot be forced. It has to be perceived and repeated. That's where real, lasting sleep begins. What actually helps is supporting the brain, not overpowering it. The goal is to gently reduce nighttime alertness, to help the nervous system stand down naturally, to stabilize melatonin so it stays active longer, and to prevent early spikes of cortisol before morning. These shifts allow the sleep switch to remain engaged. Studies show that when alert signals decrease, the brain stops monitoring and starts resting. Heart rate becomes more stable, breathing slows and deepens on its own. The deep sleep signal can reestablish itself. This doesn't happen through effort or control. It happens when the brain receives the right cues. Experts in sleep health explain that these cues are not dramatic or extreme. They are subtle, biological, and familiar to the brain. Signals that say the environment is predictable, that energy levels are stable, that nighttime is not a time for vigilance. Consistency matters more than intensity here. This is where natural complementary support comes in, not as a replacement for healthy sleep habits, but as reinforcement for the brain's safety system. Doctor-approved approaches focus on support, not suppression. They work with the body's rhythms instead of pushing against them, and they respect how the brain actually decides to sleep. When done correctly, this kind of support doesn't knock you out or override awareness. It helps the brain feel calm enough to let go. Night after night, those signals begin to add up. The brain starts to expect rest instead of alertness. And once that expectation shifts, sleep feels less fragile. To understand how this support fits into a simple daily rhythm, we need to look at how timing plays a critical role. At this point, it's important to be very clear. There is no product that forces the brain to sleep, and this approach is not about treatment or cure. It's about creating the right internal environment, one that supports the brain's natural sleep process. Sleep science explains that when the environment is right, the brain does the work on its own. The right kind of support is natural and gentle. It doesn't override the nervous system. It doesn't sedate or shut the body down. Instead, it works alongside healthy sleep habits. It reinforces the signals of safety the brain looks for at night, and it respects the timing of melatonin and cortisol. That's why experts describe it as complementary support. Doctor-approved sleep support focuses on balance, helping calm nighttime alertness, supporting stable melatonin release, and avoiding unnecessary stimulation during the night. Studies show that when these elements align, the sleep switch becomes more stable, not because it's forced, but because it's supported. This kind of support is designed to fit naturally into life. It doesn't require extreme routines or rigid rules. It works quietly in the background. Night after night, it helps the brain recognize safety. Over time, that recognition becomes familiar, and familiar signals feel safe to the nervous system. That's when sleep begins to flow more naturally. If you're curious about the support I'm describing, you don't need to search or guess. You'll find the support I'm talking about in the first pinned comment below this video. It's there as an option, not an obligation, simply as a tool to support the process, because the brain always remains in control. The most important thing to remember is this: the brain is not being fixed or corrected, it's being reassured. The support helps create the conditions, the signals guide the timing, but the brain decides when it's safe to sleep. And to see how those signals fit into a simple daily rhythm, we need to look at what happens before and after bedtime. Waking up at night does not define who you are. It doesn't say anything about your strength or discipline. It doesn't mean your sleep system is broken. Sleep science explains this as a learned biological response, one the brain adopted to protect you. And learned responses are by nature reversible, especially when the brain feels understood instead of forced. The most important shift is how you interpret the experience. Instead of seeing awakenings as failure, you begin to see them as information, signals your brain is sending about safety and timing. When those signals change, the response changes too. This perspective alone reduces nighttime fear, and fear is one of the fastest ways to keep the brain alert. Nothing here requires fighting your body. Nothing asks you to push harder or control more. The invitation is simply to observe. Notice when your mind feels alert. Notice how your body responds at night. Those patterns are not random. They follow biological rules the brain understands well. When people stop blaming themselves, their nervous system often softens slightly. That softening matters more than it sounds, because the brain listens closely to emotional signals. Calm curiosity feels very different from frustration, and calm is one of the strongest signals of safety. That's where real change begins. Experts in sleep health emphasize education for this reason. Understanding reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty lowers nighttime alertness. This is not about fixing yourself. It's about working with how the brain actually operates. Once that cooperation begins, sleep feels less fragile, and the night stops feeling like something to battle. In the next video, pinned at the end, I explain exactly which nighttime signals calm the brain fastest, and just as importantly, which common habits unknowingly keep it alert at night. These signals directly influence melatonin, cortisol, and how stable the sleep switch remains. Seeing that connection clearly changes how you approach every night.